In this video, we're going to talk about different data types that you can use inside of Wized applications. Now, if you know a little bit of JavaScript, then you will know about these data types, but if you heard us say things such as arrays and numbers and booleans, and you still don't know what all of that means, then this video will help you make sense of it all. All right, let's start with the simplest data type. We're going to start with strings. Now, strings are a collection of alphanumerical characters and symbols. So for example, if you just write regular text, it's going to be a string. We can write here, hello, user, and Wized is smart enough to interpret this already as a string. Now, you can also connect multiple strings together, or a response from your request with a string. So you could write hello, comma, and then you could get the name of the user from your request, like so, and you would select this here. Now, if you're operating inside of these logic components, then you have to add quotation marks to tell the browser that this is a string. So basically, if you want to put this value inside of these squiggly brackets, you would do this. So you could copy this, paste it inside here, and then you would wrap this with quotation marks. Also the space, and then you would add a plus sign. This way you can connect the two values. Perfect, and we have the same result. Next we have numbers. Numbers are just what they sound like, they're numbers. And you can use numbers to do math inside of Wized, or you could use them to display a price or a head count in your company. So the way you would use numbers is by simply writing a number inside. You don't need quotation marks or anything, and you could do mathematical operations right inside of Wized. So you could write 5 plus 5, that's going to be 10. Same with multiplication, division, and with subtraction. You could also combine numbers and strings together, but if you do that, they're going to be converted to strings. So if you write, for example, 5 plus items, then you're going to get 5 items. Just be aware that if you have a number in a string and a number outside of a string, you might get some weird results like this. Next we have Booleans. Booleans can only have two values, either true or false. And Booleans are often used inside of conditional statements or condition fields, and basically you can turn any value that you get from any request or a variable or a string into a Boolean. And this is where truthy and falsy values come in. So besides true and false, you have also values that evaluate to true in a Boolean context. Now this sounds very confusing, but it's quite simple. So basically if you have 0, it's going to be false. If you have 1, it's going to be true. Same thing if you have an empty string, it's going to be false. If you have a string with some text inside, it's going to be true. So you could use, for example, fields from the request inside of a conditional, which will get evaluated as a Boolean. And then if the request didn't send a response, it's going to be false. If you did get a response, it's going to be true. All right, these are Booleans in a nutshell. We have a separate video that describes truthy and falsy values in much more depth. So if you want to learn more about Booleans and conditionals, then watch the next videos. Next we have undefined. Undefined means that a variable has been declared, but no one ever added a value to it. You'll get undefined when you select a field from the request, and let's say you have a typo. So for example, if we delete this field, we can write type off to check which type is our field, and we select this, we're going to see it's a number. But if we have, let's say, a typo here, we're going to see undefined because this path is valid, it exists inside of this object, but there is no value there. So for example, if you have an error field, this is going to be undefined, except if there is an error, then an error message could be displayed. For example, if you remove this type off, you could display an error message when the error message is present. Now, undefined is also a falsy value, like we said before. So if you use this inside of a conditional, you're going to get false. All right, now that we covered undefined, we're going to talk about null. And null is very similar to undefined. It's also a falsy value. It just means that it was deliberately set. Now, I don't know if you'll encounter nulls inside of Wized, and you don't necessarily need to use it in most projects, but The way you could use it would be perhaps in an if-else statement. So for example, you could write full name as a condition, and this will evaluate either true or false. In this case, the full name is set, so it's going to be true. And then we can either choose to display the name or write null. So if the name was provided, we're going to display it. Otherwise, we're not going to do anything. So we're just going to write null. So for example, if full name is not set, we will not do anything. Now you could achieve, of course, the same thing by just adding an empty string, which I do in most cases, but just so you know that this null data type exists and you can use it if you want to. Next, we're going to cover two data types that you probably heard of: arrays and objects. Now, both arrays and objects are collections, a way to group together multiple data types into a single bundle. Let's start with objects first. So we created a logic component in Wized, and here I'm just going to use JavaScript to create an object. This is not something you would do, but I'm just going to use this in this tutorial so that you can know how objects are being dealt with. In this case, I'm going to call this object table, and we're going to add squiggly brackets at the end and at the beginning. So whenever you have key value pairs inside of squiggly brackets like so, know that you're dealing with an object. So for example, we could have, let's say, name equals John, and then we would have another property, which is surname Doe. Now, if this looks like a JSON file, well, you're right. A JSON is basically a JavaScript object. JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. So if we would have a table, we would have in the header name and surname, and then in the first row as the values, we would have John and Doe. And this is basically how objects work. Now, if we wanted to reference any property from the object, we would basically do this. Still inside the logic block, we would write our table name. In this case, it's table. So we would write table dot, and then we would write the property. So if we wanted to access John, we would write table dot name, and we would get John. Same with surname. And you could also have objects inside of objects. So let's say our first property is person, and then we would wrap all of this inside of an object. So basically like this. And we would wrap the name and the surname inside of an object. So our object would finish here. We could now write table dot person dot name, and we would get John. And if this pattern looks very familiar, well, this is exactly what we have here in our requests. So we have the request object, and then we have properties that are nested inside. So this way you could access any property that you have in your request. Now you might be thinking, what if our data table has also only the name and surname column, but we have several names and several surnames? Well, this is where arrays come in. So if you would have inside of this table, you would have person, you would have people, let's say. We have to change it here as well. Oh, I have a typo. And if we would want to add multiple names, basically we would have to wrap this inside of square brackets, which signifies that we are inside of an array. And here we would add multiple names. Basically, an array is similar to an object. The major difference is that it's just a collection of comma-separated values. So we don't have key value pairs. In this case, we could have here John, we could have Peter, we could have Jane, and of course, this needs to be also a string. And now, if we wanted to access any of these names, we would do it like this. We would add square brackets here at name, and then we would write the index of the item that we want to access. So in this case, we can have John, Peter, and Jane. So John would have an index of 0, Peter would have an index of 1, and Jane would have an index of 2. Note that arrays always start at 0. So we would write here 0 for John, 1 for Peter, and 2 for Jane. And inside of arrays, we could have any other values. We can have true, false, we can also have numbers, we can also have other objects, and we can have nested arrays as well. So the way you would use arrays normally in Wized is to either render a list from the array itself. In this case, if we select this and we have an array, we could use this array to render a list. Normally, you select this from a request, like in this case, we could get the products and we would select this array from which we want to render a list. Then if we wanted to only select the first item that's inside of the array, we would add the number. So basically we would write here 0. And here you can see that this corresponds exactly to the same pattern we have here. So let's delete that. Let's add this field. And you can do the same thing here. So you have 0, 1. If you scroll down, then you have 2, which is this field over here, and so on. Just note that if you're rendering a list of items, then you will also need something called an iterator variable, which is basically a value that increments with every person. So basically, if you want to render a list of all of these items, you would have an iterator variable inside, which will increment and then display each one of the names. So let's sum up what we just learned. First, we learned that we can store alphanumerical characters in strings, such as email addresses, names, surnames, URLs, etc. Then we talked about numbers, and we learned that we can do math inside of Wized with numbers, or we can display a price or a head count, etc. Then we moved to Booleans. Booleans have only two values, true and false, and we talked also about truthy and falsy values as well. Then we covered quickly undefined and null. And finally, we talked about arrays and objects, and we mentioned how these are a way to group together multiple data types into one single collection, so to say. That's it for today's video. I hope that with this video, I helped you demystify all these different data types and that you'll start navigating easier in Wized from now on. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.